Earth's reaction to genocide. No more playing Civilized. The broadcast ran for 42 minutes. I watched all of it. That was the job. Document everything. Maintain neutrality. File the report on time. I was Commander Yale Oren, United Earth Fleet Liaison to the Galactic Conclave, and I had been doing this job for 11 years without once breaking protocol. I was good at it. I was very, very good at sitting still when everything inside me was screaming to move. The Veldari fleet had positioned itself in high orbit above Auran Prime 4 days before I even received my orders to monitor the situation. By the time my observation vessel reached the system, the orbital grid was already locked. 43 Veldari warships arranged in a planetary arc, each one carrying enough firepower to level a continent. The Auran had no fleet to speak of. They had orbital stations, 6 of them, built for science and trade, not combat. Those went quiet on the first day. No debris. No explosion signatures, just silence, which was somehow worse. The broadcast began on a Tuesday. Local time meant nothing out here, but I had kept Earth's calendar since the day I left home, and it was a Tuesday. The Veldari High Directorate transmitted it on every open channel, coded as Public Administrative Announcement, which was the kind of language they used when they wanted the galaxy to hear something, but did not want to call it what it was. What it was the end of a civilization. I watched the surface of Auran Prime from the feed. The Auran were a small species, bird-framed, pale-feathered, with voices that sounded like wind through a hollow reed. I had met 3 of them once, at a conclave cultural exchange, and they had sung a greeting instead of speaking one. I still remembered the sound of it. Standing at my observation console, watching the feed, I remembered it very clearly. The capital city was called Vel Saur, which translated, roughly, as the place where rivers meet. It had stood for over 4,000 years. It had libraries older than Rome. It had a central plaza where every morning, by tradition going back longer than any human institution I could name, the Auran gathered to sing the sun up. The Veldari targeting solution was precise. I will give them that. They did not waste ordnance. The bombardment of Vel Saur lasted 11 minutes. When the thermal imaging cleared, there was nothing left above ground. The ground itself had turned. I do not have a better word for what it looked like. It was glass, smooth and dark and absolute, in a perfect radius of 40 kilometers. I watched the rest of the broadcast because it was my job to watch it. Then I sat for a long time in the dark of my observation bay and did not move. I had known, intellectually, that this was possible. The Veldari had done something similar twice before in recorded galactic history. Once to the Sheth colonies 400 years ago, and once, very quietly, to a pre-contact species on a world designated only by a catalog number. In both cases, the Galactic Conclave had issued formal statements of concern. In both cases, the Veldari had paid fines equivalent to roughly what you would spend on a moderately nice dinner on Tarathi Prime. In both cases, the galaxy had moved on. The Auran had refused a resource extraction treaty. That was the entire reason. The Veldari wanted rights to a mineral deposit in the Auran outer belt, a deposit worth, by Conclave economic estimates, approximately 900 billion trade units. The Auran had said no. They had said no politely, and then through formal channels, and then through 3 rounds of conclave mediation. They had said no the way a people say no when they believe the word means something. The Veldari response to the word no had taken 4 days to organize and 11 minutes to deliver. I attended the conclave emergency session remotely. My observation vessel was not fast enough to reach the conclave station in less than 6 days, so I joined by signal relay my face one small rectangle in a grid of hundreds. The chamber was enormous. I had been in it in person only twice. It seated representatives from 212 recognized species, arranged in curved tiers that swept up toward a vaulted ceiling carved from a single piece of asteroid iron. It was, without question, the most impressive room in the known galaxy. The most impressive room in the known galaxy spent 4 hours discussing procedural timelines. Ambassador Sivan of the Tarathi hegemony spoke for a long time about the importance of due process. He had a voice like deep water, slow, resonant, carrying enormous weight with very little effort. I had always respected Sivan. He was not a bad person. He genuinely believed in the framework he was defending. He believed that the framework, if followed faithfully and patiently, produced the best outcomes over time. I looked at the thermal imaging of Vel Saur in the corner of my screen while he spoke. The vote on formal conclave intervention was scheduled for 90 days from the date of the emergency session. 90 days was considered, by conclave standards, an expedited timeline. Several ambassadors noted this with what sounded like pride. The surviving Auran population was estimated at just over 4 million. Before Tuesday, there had been 6,200,000. In 4 days, most of that number lost in the 11 minutes of Velsor. 2,200,000 people were gone. The conclave had scheduled a vote for 90 days from now. After the session ended, I sat in the dark again for a while. Then I did 2 things. The first thing was that I filed my neutrality report. I had been filing them every 72 hours since the crisis began. I was thorough. I included everything: the thermal imaging data, the signal intercepts, the conclave session transcript, the Orin refugee vessel coordinates I had tracked on passive sensors. 6 ships, barely functional, running on emergency power, carrying approximately 40,000 survivors who were drifting in the dark and hoping no one noticed them. I included all of it, formatted correctly, transmitted on the proper channel, time-stamped and filed. The second thing I did was open a second channel, encrypted, direct to Earth's Admiralty Command on a frequency that did not appear in my official communications log, because I had spent 3 years before this posting working in signals intelligence, and I knew which frequencies did not appear in official communications logs. I sent 3 words: "They need us." Then I closed the channel and made myself a cup of coffee, real coffee, from grounds, because I had learned a long time ago that the ritual of it mattered when everything else was unraveling. And I sat at my console and I waited. I told myself I did not know what I was waiting for. That was not true. I knew exactly what I was waiting for. I had grown up on Earth. I had gone to school there, made friends there, fallen in love there, lost people there. I knew what Earth looked like when it was paying attention to something. I knew what Earth looked like when it got quiet in a particular way. I had been born on a Tuesday too, which felt like it meant something, although I could not have told you what. The coffee went cold. I did not notice. I was watching the refugee ships on passive sensors, 6 dim signatures moving slowly away from Auran Prime, from what used to be Auran Prime, trying to put distance between themselves and the Veldari fleet that had not bothered to pursue them because the Veldari did not consider 40,000 Auran survivors to be worth the fuel cost. That detail, more than the 42-minute broadcast, more than the thermal imaging, more than the 4-hour procedural discussion in the most impressive room in the galaxy. That detail was the one that stayed with me. The casual arithmetic of it. The calculation that said 40,000 lives were not worth a course correction. I thought about the Auran I had met at the cultural exchange. The way they sang instead of speaking. I thought about the plaza in Velsor, where they had gathered every morning for 4,000 years to greet the sun. I thought about the word the Veldari had used in their broadcast to describe what they had done. The word was corrective. My console chimed softly. An incoming signal on the encrypted channel. I straightened in my chair without meaning to, some old reflex from 11 years of military service. The message was 4 words: "We are on our way." I read it twice. Then I set down my cold coffee and looked out the viewport at the dark between the stars. And for the first time in 4 days, I took a full breath. I did not know yet what was coming. I did not know the shape of it, or the cost of it, or what it would make us, what it would change about what we were in the eyes of every other species watching. I did not know any of that. What I knew was that Earth had gotten quiet in exactly the way I recognized. And I knew that when Earth got quiet like that, the next thing that happened was very loud. I saw them drop out of faster-than-light travel at 0317 station time, and even through the filtered sensors of my observation vessel, even rendered in the flat gray of long-range detection data. The sight of them stopped my breath. 87 ships. I had served on Earth vessels. I had spent 11 years moving through the galaxy in a diplomatic capacity, which meant I flew light, fast courier vessels, small frigates, observation platforms. I had not stood in the path of a full Earth military deployment since my training days, and even then it had been a simulation, and even then it had made my hands feel strange. This was not a simulation. The Veldari had beautiful ships. Every species that had been spacefaring for more than 1,000 years had beautiful ships, because time and resources allowed for elegance. The Veldari fleet in orbit above what remained of Auran Prime was composed of vessels that looked like something between a cathedral and a blade. Long, tapered, gleaming with the kind of design philosophy that said we have been doing this for a very long time and we know exactly what we are doing. Earth's fleet did not look like that. Earth's fleet looked like a fist. The warships were wide-bodied and brutally functional, built on a philosophy that had nothing to do with elegance and everything to do with persistence. They were modular. I could see even at distance that the hull sections were designed to be replaced, repaired, restructured while underway. They bristled with sensor arrays and point defense networks and weapon systems that had been developed, iterated, and redesigned across 6 generations of engineers who had approached the problem of warfare with the same stubborn, Furious creativity that humans brought to every problem they decided actually mattered. They were not the most beautiful ships in the galaxy. They were the most serious ships I had ever seen. The conclave erupted before the fleet had even finished forming up. My relay channel lit up with incoming traffic before I could process what I was seeing. Ambassador Sivan's office sent 3 separate formal protests within the first 8 minutes. The Veldari High Directorate transmitted a legal brief 32 pages long. I know because someone in Earth's Admiralty forwarded it to me with a note that reads simply, "Thought you should see this." The Conclave Secretary General herself sent a direct priority message to Earth's lead vessel, demanding immediate acknowledgement of the following list of violated frameworks: the Advisory Charter of 2201, the Neutrality Accords of 2287, subclauses 14 through 17 of the Galactic Peace Framework, the Conclave Non-Intervention Resolution, and something called the Procedural Dignity Agreement, which I had genuinely never heard of before, and which I suspected had been drafted and ratified specifically in the last 8 minutes. Earth's response arrived 4 minutes later. It was transmitted by Secretary General Diane Aldrich herself from the steps of the Admiralty Building in Cape Town, and I played it 3 times because I wanted to make sure I had heard it correctly. She said, "We have received your concerns. Please invoice us. We will discuss it when we are done." Then the channel closed. I was reassigned before the echo of that message had finished reverberating through the conclave relay system. Reassigned is, perhaps too formal a word. What actually happened was that I sent a request to Captain Haruto Meisei of UE's Meridian, the fleet's command vessel, a heavy cruiser that sat at the center of the formation like the knuckle of the fist, asking permission to come aboard as tactical liaison. May sent back a response that said, "Get here fast." So I flew my observation vessel to the Meridian's docking bay and I got there fast. The Meridian's interior was nothing like the Veldari ships. There was no elegance in the corridors. Everything was functional, wide enough for crew to move quickly, lit at a practical brightness, marked with clear signage, equipped with redundant systems at every junction. The air smelled like recycled atmosphere and something metallic that I associated, from old memory, with readiness. People moved through those corridors with a specific kind of purpose, not hurried, not panicked, but absolutely, completely focused. Every person I passed was doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing, and doing it completely. I found Captain Mays on the bridge. He was a compact man, somewhere in his late 50s, with a face that had spent a great deal of time looking at things that were difficult to look at, and had made its peace with that. He handed me a data tablet without preamble. "Passive intercepts from the refugee ships," he said. 6 vessels. We have their locations. We also have their medical status broadcasts. 2 of them have reported life support degradation. We are going to them first. Before engaging the Veldari fleet? Before everything, he said. We came here for the Awan. We start there. I had worked with a great many military commanders over 11 years of liaison work. I had worked with commanders who were brilliant tacticians, and commanders who were political animals, and commanders who were both, and commanders who were neither. I had not worked with many commanders who opened a conversation by talking about life support on refugee vessels before they talked about the enemy fleet. I found I respected it in a way that I could not fully articulate. We reached the refugee ships in 4 hours. The 2 vessels with life support degradation were brought into the Meridian's docking bays directly. The other 4 were escorted to a safe position behind the Earth fleet's formation and given power transfer connections to stabilize their systems. I was part of the first boarding team because I spoke a functional vocabulary of Auran, about 300 words, learned from data archives and the brief cultural exchange years ago. And because, as Mace put it, "You've been watching this happen for 2 weeks, and I need someone who knows the context." The inside of the refugee vessel smelled like fear. I know that sounds like an exaggeration, but it does not feel like one. The air was stale and overcrowded, and there was a specific undertone to it that I cannot describe in chemical terms, but that I recognized from emergency response training on Earth as the smell of a space that has held too many frightened people for too long. There were thousands of them in that hold. The Auran were small. The adults stood perhaps to my shoulder, and they pressed together in groups, the way they apparently did under stress. Each group gathered around a central elder with the younger ones tucked close. Their feathers were dulled with exhaustion. Many of them had injuries that had been treated with whatever was available on the vessel, which was not much. They were very quiet. They watched us come through the hatch with eyes that were large and dark, and had seen the broadcast too, had seen what we had all seen, except that they had watched it from inside it. I do not know what they expected from us. I do not know what they had been told about humans, or if they had been told anything at all. An elder stepped forward. She was smaller than the others, older, her feathers more silver than white, her movements careful in the way of someone managing pain. She looked at me, and she spoke, and I caught about a third of it, and what I caught was, "Why are you here?" I answered in her language, badly, with the 300 words I had. I said, "Because you needed someone, because we saw, because we could not continue to watch." She was quiet for a moment. She tilted her head in the particular way Auron did when they were processing something emotional. I had read about it in the cultural archive, but reading about it and seeing it were different things. Then she spoke one word that I did not need to look up. It was a word that appeared in the first page of every Auron language guide ever compiled, because it was ancient and fundamental, and it meant, depending on context, either witnessed or remembered, and in many contexts it meant both. I nodded. I could not speak for a moment. Behind me, a medic named Owen Garrett was already moving through the hold with a scanner. Quiet and efficient, not waiting for orders. 3 other crew members had brought food from the Meridian stores. Nobody had told them to do that. They had just brought it. I stood there watching my crew move through a hold full of frightened survivors, bringing food and medicine and simply being present, and I thought, this is also what humans are. This is also part of what we are. The fist and the food. The fleet and the medic who doesn't wait to be asked. I went back to the bridge and told Maze that the medical situation was under control. He nodded once. "Good," he said. "Then we can talk about the Veldari fleet." The Veldari Admiral, a senior directorate officer named in the intercepts as Commander Delegate. Oren Sev had by this point sent 4 formal communiques to the Meridian. Each one was longer than the last. The final one ran to 61 pages. It cited every treaty Earth had signed since joining the Conclave, every framework we were violating, every legal precedent that required us to withdraw, and it ended with a sentence that Maze read aloud to me once. "Your presence in this system constitutes an act of interstellar aggression, for which your species will bear full legal and economic consequence." Maze put down the tablet. "Transmit a response," he said to his communications officer, a young woman named Claire Bates who had the particular calm of someone who had prepared for exactly this moment. One sentence. "Tell them, we acknowledge your communication." "That is all?" Bates asked. "That is all." I thought about the 61-page document. I thought about one sentence in response. I thought about what that one sentence communicated about what was coming next, and I looked at the Veldari fleet on the tactical display. 43 ships, well-positioned, holding formation, and I looked at our 87, and I thought about all the things that were true about humans that the galaxy knew, and all the things that were true about humans that the galaxy had not yet learned. On the tactical display, the Veldari fleet was beginning to move, so were we. The Veldari had fought 53 wars. I know this because the Conclave Historical Archive was accessible from my console on the Meridian's bridge, and while Claire Bates was running the communications panel and the tactical officers were running their calculations, I was reading. Old habit. 11 years of liaison work had trained me to know the history of whoever was on the other side of a situation before the situation got any worse. 53 wars in 2,000 years, a remarkable record actually. The Veldari were not reckless or bloodthirsty by galactic standards. There were species in the Conclave with far higher conflict tallies. What made the Veldari record notable was not the number, but the outcome column. 53 wars, 53 resolved by negotiated settlement, every single one. The Veldari had never fought to total conclusion. They engaged until one side had demonstrated clear advantage, and then someone sat down at a table, and then there were terms, and then it was over. It was, I thought, a very sensible way to conduct warfare if you assumed the other side operated by the same logic. I closed the archive. Captain Maze had not slept. I could tell by the particular stillness he had settled into. The kind that people develop when the body wants sleep and the mind refuses it, and the compromise is a state of absolute, locked focus that looks like calm but costs a great deal. He was standing at the tactical display, tracking the Veldari repositioning with the same expression he had used when reading the 61-page legal communique. The Veldari fleet had reorganized into a defensive arc around the remaining Auron orbital infrastructure, which was, essentially, nothing at this point, but the positioning communicated something. It said, "This space belongs to us. This situation is resolved. Your arrival changes nothing." It was a posture designed to force Earth's fleet into either a direct engagement, which the Veldari expected us to be reluctant to start, or a standoff negotiation which was familiar territory for them. What they were not prepared for was that we were not reluctant. The engagement began at 0614 hours station time. I am not going to describe it the way a tactical report would describe it, with vectors and weapon signatures and engagement percentages. I am going to describe it the way I experienced it, which was standing on the Meridian's bridge watching a dozen screens at once, my hands gripping the edge of a console I had no formal role operating, my heart doing something complicated in my chest. The Veldari ships were faster. Individually, ship to ship, they had the edge in speed and maneuverability. Their targeting systems were older in design but refined across centuries of iteration, and their crews were experienced in exactly this kind of standoff engagement. In any one-on-one comparison, a Veldari warship could likely have handled most of what Earth sent at it. The problem for the Veldari was that Earth had not sent ships one at a time. Earth had sent 87 ships that were designed to operate as a system. Every vessel in the fleet was networked to every other vessel in real time. Sensor data, tactical calculations, damage assessments, targeting solutions, all of it flowing continuously across the formation. When one ship took damage, the others automatically redistributed coverage of its position. When one weapons array went offline, the targeting solution it had been carrying transferred to the nearest available system, without any human operator having to make that call. The fleet thought together. It was not a collection of ships. It was one thing with 87 bodies. The Veldari had never encountered anything like it. They attempted to isolate individual Earth vessels, drawing them out of formation with feinting maneuvers that had worked in 47 of their 53 wars. The Earth ships did not take the bait. They moved in coordinated groups, maintaining their network coverage, absorbing hit after hit from Veldari long-range weapons with a stubbornness that seemed, to me watching the tactical screens, almost personal. One ship took 3 direct strikes in 90 seconds and kept its position. The crew rerouted, repaired what could be repaired immediately, and did not move. The Veldari escalated. I watched the weapon's signature data change on the screen. Heavier ordnance, longer range systems, the kind of firepower that was meant to communicate. We can make this as painful as necessary. Earth's fleet absorbed it the way a wall absorbs rain. Then at 0847 hours, the Veldari sent a signal. It was formatted as a parley request, a formal ceasefire call, a recognized galactic convention that predated the conclave itself. 12 hours, both fleets hold position. Commanders communicate directly. In 53 wars, the parley had always been accepted. It was the first step toward the negotiating table. It was, in the Veldari understanding of how conflict worked, the beginning of the end. Mays read the parley request. Then he looked at his signals intelligence officer, a quiet man named Peter Hadley, who had not raised his voice once since the engagement began. Hadley, Mays said. Hadley looked up from his console. Yes, sir. The intercepts confirm it. Directorate Tactical Channel 13 minutes ago. They plan to use the parley window to resume surface engagement at the 3 remaining Auran settlement coordinates. The ones with survivors. The bridge was very quiet. Mays turned back to the communications panel. Bates, he said, transmit our response to the parley request. Yes. Captain, Bates said. Your response is no, May said. Bates transmitted it. One word, no. What happened next was not immediate. There were a few seconds of signal delay, and then the conclave observer channels, which had been broadcasting the engagement live to the entire galaxy, went very strange. I can only describe it as stunned silence rendered in text. Status messages stopped. The running commentary from the conclave press relay, which had been breathlessly documenting every development for 22 hours, simply stopped mid-sentence. Not because the systems had failed, because the operators had no words. In 10,000 years of recorded galactic warfare, no fleet had ever refused a parley signal. Every war had rules, not formal rules, not laws, but practices, conventions. The shared understanding that conflict was a negotiation conducted by other means, and that certain gestures had to be respected, because they were how the whole thing ever ended. The parley was one of those gestures. It was practically sacred. Refusing it was so outside the understood framework of how war worked that the galaxy, watching in real time, simply could not immediately process it. I understood why Mays had refused. I had known from the moment Hadley showed him the intercepts, but I also felt the weight of that refusal in a way I had not expected. We had just done something that the galaxy would remember. We had stepped outside the framework. Not accidentally, not carelessly, deliberately, with full knowledge of what the intercepts showed. Choosing the lives of Auran survivors over compliance with a galactic convention that the Veldari had been planning to exploit to end those lives. We had made a choice about what mattered more, and we had made it without asking anyone's permission. The Vuldari fleet, after the refusal, held position for 22 minutes. I watched them on the tactical display. They were calculating, I assumed reassessing, communicating with the Directorate, trying to determine what to do with an opponent who did not respond to the expected signals. Then, without formal announcement, without another communication of any kind, they began to withdraw. Not a retreat in the chaotic sense. They were too disciplined for that. An organized repositioning, ships pulling back in sequence, maintaining formation, preserving their dignity as they went. It was, even in withdrawal, an elegant maneuver. I noted that. The Vuldari were not fools. They had recognized something they did not understand, and they were removing themselves from its immediate range while they figured out what it was. The engagement officially ended at 11:03 hours. On the Conclave Observer channels, the commentary slowly resumed. I read some of it from my console while Maze oversaw the post-engagement assessment. The reactions ranged from outrage at Earth's violation of the Parley Convention to something I had not expected. A quieter, more careful conversation, mostly between smaller species and junior conclave members, asking a question that had not been asked in a very long time. The question was, were we on the wrong side of this? A few hours later, a message arrived for me personally. It was from Commander Delegate Oren Sev of the Vuldari fleet. He had addressed it to me specifically, I understood, because I was the liaison. Because I was the one who existed in the space between Earth and the rest of the galaxy, the one who might still be reasonable, the one who might still speak a language he recognized. The message said, "You have started something your species cannot finish." I read it several times. Then I opened a reply and I wrote 4 words. "We have not started." I sent it. Then I went to find something to eat, because I had not eaten since before the engagement began and my hands were shaking slightly, and I had learned long ago that sometimes the body needed tending before anything else could happen. In the corridor outside the galley, I passed a crewman carrying a tray of food toward the docking bay where the Auran refugees were being housed. He was a young man, maybe 24, and he had clearly come off a 12-hour rotation, and had clearly been awake for longer than that, and he was carrying the tray with the same focused care that the Meridian's crew seemed to bring to everything, and he nodded at me as he passed. I thought about 53 wars that all ended at a table. I thought about what it meant that we had refused the first invitation to sit down. I thought about the 3 settlements on the Auran surface that still had survivors in them. And I thought about what would have happened to those survivors in the 12 hours of a ceasefire that we had read the plans for, and refused to grant. I did not feel good. I want to be clear about that. I did not feel triumphant or clean or certain. I felt the full weight of what we had done and what we had chosen and what it meant, and it sat in my chest like something heavy. But I also felt, underneath that weight, something else. Something that had been absent since the moment I watched the 42-minute broadcast from the most impressive room in the galaxy, and listened to procedural timelines being discussed with what sounded like pride. I felt like we had done something real. The Vuldari signed the ceasefire on a Friday morning. I was not in the room when it happened. The formal signing took place on a conclave-neutral vessel that had arrived in the system 3 days after the engagement ended. A massive, diplomatic platform called the Accord of Voices, which was essentially a floating conference center the size of a small city, and which smelled, everywhere inside it, like the particular combination of recycled air and diplomatic tension that I had spent 11 years learning to breathe. I was in a smaller room, 2 levels below the main chamber, sitting across a narrow table from 2 Vuldari Directorate officials who had been asked to speak with me specifically. The request had come from the Conclave Mediation Office and had been worded very carefully. A contextual conversation about the events of the preceding weeks. Not a hearing, not an interrogation, a conversation. The distinction mattered to the Conclave, so I let it matter to me. The 2 officials were polite in the particular way that powerful people are. Polite when they have recently experienced something they did not expect. Their names were Counselor Everton and Deputy Administrator Lisra Sev, the Admiral's younger relative, which I had not known until she introduced herself. She was younger than I had expected, with steady eyes and the careful posture of someone who had learned early that being related to authority was both an advantage and a burden. Counselor Ton opened by telling me, very calmly and without apparent emotion, that Earth had violated 14 separate conclave agreements. He listed them. He had a list. It was a physical document and he had it in his hand, and he read from it with the methodical patience of someone who wanted the record to be absolutely clear. I let him finish. Then I said, You're right, that stopped him. He had, I think, expected me to argue. You are entirely correct, I said. We violated the agreements. We knew we were violating them. We did it anyway. Then you admit liability, he said. I admit action, I said. Whether it constitutes liability depends on whether the agreements themselves were functioning as intended. The neutrality accords, the non-intervention resolution, the procedural dignity agreement. They exist to protect species from exactly what happened to the Auran. They did not protect the Auran. We stepped outside them because they had failed before we arrived. Lyra Sev had not spoken yet. She was watching me with those steady eyes. Now she said quietly, "You could have brought that argument to the conclave." The conclave had scheduled a vote for 90 days from the day of the emergency session, I said. The Auran survivors we found on those 6 vessels had 48 hours of life support remaining on 2 of the ships. She was quiet. I am not saying the framework is worthless, I said. I am saying the framework had a gap. And when a framework has a gap and people are in the gap, you don't file a report about the gap and schedule a vote. You reach in. Ton set down his list. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at me. The parley signal, he said. In 10,000 years, we intercepted your tactical communications, I said. We knew what you planned to do with the 12 hours. Another silence. Longer this time. The settlements, Lyra Sev said. Not a question. A realization arriving in real time. There were survivors in all 3, I said. We had their positions on passive sensors. Your tactical channel, 13 minutes before the parley signal, transmitted targeting coordinates for all 3 locations. The room was very quiet. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. Part of me wanted them to feel what I felt watching the 42-minute broadcast. Part of me wanted to lay the full weight of it across that table and make them hold it. But that part was not the part I was there to listen to. I was there as a liaison, which meant I was there to build something, however fragile, however early, in the space between what had happened and what might happen next. I am not your enemy, I said. Earth is not your enemy. What we are is a species that ran out of patience for watching something happen and calling it acceptable because the paperwork was in order. Ton picked up his list. He folded it slowly. He put it in his jacket. There will be formal consequences, he said. The conclave behavioral review. I know, I said. We will cooperate with the review. We will sit in the chamber and we will answer every question. What we will not do is apologize for the decision to go. The meeting ended without resolution, which was expected. Resolution was not the point of that particular meeting. The point was that the conversation had happened at all. That 2 Veldari Directorate officials had sat across a table from a human officer and spoken in full sentences, and nobody had refused to be in the room, and the list had been folded and put away rather than read a second time. It was a very small thing. At the time, it felt like the most important thing I had done in weeks. I went from that meeting to another one. The Conclave Behavioral Review Tribunal had convened on the Accord of Voices as well. Another small room, another narrow table, this one with 7 Conclave representatives seated in a curved arc. Amsbasser Savan was among them. He met my eyes when I sat down, and his expression was not hostile. It was something more complicated than that. They asked me to explain my encrypted transmission to Earth's Admiralty, the one I had sent from my observation vessel. The 3 words. I explained it. I told them what I had seen in the 42-minute broadcast. I told them what I had heard in the emergency session. I told them about the 90-day vote timeline, and the 48 hours of life support on the refugee vessels, and the 3-hour settlement, coordinates on the tactical intercepts. I told them all of it, in order, plainly, without dramatics, because the facts did not need dramatizing. Then I said, you built a framework for civilized behavior between spacefaring species. It is a good framework. It has prevented a great many conflicts. I respect it and I will continue to work within it wherever it functions. But you did not build a mechanism for what to do when civilized behavior becomes the mechanism through which destruction is conducted. The Veldari used every procedural channel, correctly. They filed the extraction treaty through proper means. When it was refused, they escalated through the correct channels. When negotiation failed, they submitted formal documentation to the conclave before acting. The conclave issued a statement of concern. The Veldari paid attention to what the statement of concern produced, which was a 90-day vote, and they proceeded accordingly. Every step was civilized, the outcome was not. The chamber was very quiet. Sivan spoke. His deep-water voice was slower than usual, more careful. You are saying the framework enabled it. I am saying the framework did not prevent it, I said. And I am saying that 3 words sent on an encrypted channel, 3 words that brought 87 ships to a system where 40,000 people were drifting with failing life support, prevented more of it. I will stand behind those 3 words for the rest of my life. The tribunal asked several more questions. I answered them all. Then they dismissed me, and I walked out into the corridor of the Accord of Voices, and I leaned against the wall for a moment with my eyes closed. My console buzzed. A message. It was from the Auran Elder. She was on one of the refugee vessels that had been moved to a temporary safe harbor, a neutral world 3 systems away, provided by the Torathi hegemony, in what was either a genuine act of conscience or a political calculation designed to improve their standing, and I had decided it did not matter which because the result was the same. The Elder's message was short. She wrote in Auran, and the translation software rendered it with its usual slight awkwardness, but the meaning was clear. She said, "My people have a word for a wound that changes you permanently but does not destroy you." She said, "It is the worst kind of wound and also the most important kind." She said, "You will carry what happened here." She said, "That is how you know it was real." I read the message twice. Then I sent back the one word I had learned from her. The first time we spoke on the refugee vessel, the word that meant both witnessed and remembered. I meant it both ways. Back in my quarters on the Accord of Voices that evening, I found that I had received over 4,000 personal messages from Earth since the engagement had ended. I had known they were there. My console had been showing the count climbing for days, but I had not opened any of them. I opened a random selection that evening. Not a large sample. 20 messages. 8 of them said some version of "You did the right thing. We are proud of you, thank you." 7 of them said some version of "You had no authority to do this. You have made Earth a rogue state. You may have started something we cannot control." 3 of them said, "I don't know what to think. I'm glad the Auran survived. I'm scared about what comes next." 2 of them said, "What are we now?" I sat with that question for a long time. I did not have an answer, not yet. What I had was the weight of the decision, and the knowledge that we had made it, and the understanding that some decisions change the shape of things so completely that you cannot step back through them into the shape that existed. Before we had stepped outside the framework, we had refused the parley. We had sent 3 words on an encrypted channel, and brought 87 ships to a system where a species was being removed from existence because they had said no to a mining contract. We had done all of that. And we were going to have to figure out what we were in the aftermath of it. Not the species the galaxy had categorized us as, not the emotional and impulsive junior members kept on a short leash, but whatever we were becoming in the space after the first time we stopped waiting for permission. I was not sure yet whether that thing was frightening or necessary. I suspected it was both. The new coalition did not have a name for the first 3 months. That was not an oversight. It was, as I came to understand it, a deliberate choice. A recognition that naming something too early fixes it into a shape it may not yet be ready to hold. Secretary General Aldrich had made that argument in the first planning session, and the representatives of the 11 species who had quietly reached out to Earth in the weeks after the engagement had one by one agreed with her logic. They had all survived in the Conclave's shadow for long enough to know that institutions, which named themselves before they understood what they were, tended to become exactly that name and nothing more. So for 3 months, it was simply called the Working Group, and it met on a rotating schedule across different member systems, and it had no fixed headquarters and no formal charter and no official status in conclave law. What it had was a shared understanding that something had broken and something needed to replace it. Not the entire conclave. The conclave had its uses, and dismantling it would have created a vacuum that nothing was ready to fill. But within the conclave's architecture, there was a gap. The 42-minute broadcast had been that gap made visible. A gap where the process worked correctly and the outcome was catastrophic. A gap where correctness and justice had separated so completely that they were standing in different rooms, and no one had built a door between them. The working group was an attempt at a door. I served as Earth's representative because Mesa had recommended me and Aldrich had agreed, and I had not been given much choice in the matter, which was fine. I was good at the work. I had spent 11 years learning the architecture of galactic diplomacy from the inside, and I understood exactly where its foundations were solid and exactly where they were not. I also served because I was the one who had sent the 3 words, and I believed then, as I believe now, that if you start something, you do not get to hand it to someone else when it becomes complicated. It had become complicated. The Veldari situation was the most immediate complexity. The ceasefire held. The formal Veldari response to the engagement had been the 61-page legal document. Then silence, then the signing of the ceasefire terms, then a period of what the conclave mediators called strategic reassessment and what I called, in private, A species reckoning with the first time something surprised them in 2,000 years. What I had not anticipated was the fracture inside the Veldari Directorate itself. It began with small signals, dissenting statements from regional governors, an editorial in the Veldari academic press questioning the corrective action framing, a junior directorate member publicly resigning over what she called the moral accounting of the Auran outcome. Small things. But the Veldari were a hierarchical species with a strong tradition of internal consensus, and small public fractures in a culture like that were the visible tips of much larger internal movements. 6 weeks after the ceasefire, I received a message through a channel I did not recognize. It took my signals intelligence contact 2 days to trace it. When he did, he called me directly to tell me the result, which was unusual enough that I knew before he spoke what category of unusual it was going to be. The message was from a Veldari reformist group, younger members of the directorate, mid-level administrators, a few military officers who had served on the engagement but were not named in any of the formal post-action reports. The message was 3 paragraphs long. It said, in careful formal language, that they wanted to speak with someone from Earth, not about the ceasefire terms or the conclave review or the legal frameworks, about the decision-making process that had led to the Auran situation, about what they had been told was acceptable, and what they now understood was not. I took this to Aldrich. She read the message. She was quiet for a long time. What do you think? She asked. I think it's real, I said. I think some of them were in that fleet, and they watched what our fleet did, and it made them think about what they were doing in that fleet. And that is an uncomfortable thing to think about, and they are trying to do something with the discomfort. It could be intelligence gathering, she said, a way to map our positions and intentions. It could be, I said. It could also be exactly what it looks like. People who want to talk to someone who chose differently than their leaders did, because they are trying to choose differently themselves. The political cost of you meeting with them is significant, she said. I know. She was quiet again. Then she said, what do you want to do? This was one of the things I respected most about Diane Aldrich. She did not ask what the strategically optimal choice was. She asked what I wanted to do, which was a different question and a more honest one. I want to extend the hand, I said. I think refusing it makes us the same as the framework we refused. We did not go to the Auran system to prove we were stronger than the Veldari. We went because we could not watch anymore. If we close the door on the first Veldari, who are willing to look at what happened and say it was wrong, then we have made all of this about winning, and winning is not what we were after. She gave me the authorization that afternoon. The meeting was small. 3 people on their side, 2 on mine, myself and a young foreign policy analyst named Nadia Reeves, who had been working on the reformist intelligence assessment, and who had a particular gift for listening to what people meant, rather than only what they said. We met on a neutral communications platform, text only for security, at 0200 station time when both fleets' monitoring traffic was at its lowest. The Veldari reformists were careful. They did not apologize. That would come later, and from different people, and I understood that it was not what this conversation was about. What they did was ask questions. They wanted to understand the intercept. They wanted to understand the parley refusal. They wanted to understand how we had known, in that moment with certainty, that the ceasefire offer was not genuine. I told them, not as an accusation, as information. This is what we heard on your tactical channel. This is what it said. This is what it meant for the 3 surface settlements. This is why the answer was no. There was a long pause in the text exchange. Then the most senior of the 3 wrote, we did not know about the settlement targeting. I read that sentence several times. The fleet's tactical planning is handled by a command tier we do not have access to, he wrote. We were told the parley was a genuine offer. We believed it. Nadia and I exchanged a look. What you are telling me, I wrote carefully, is that the Directorate Command deceived its own officers about the parley's purpose. Yes, he wrote. That is what I am telling you. The conversation went on for 2 more hours. I will not reproduce all of it here. What I will say is that by the end, I was certain of 2 things. The first was that the fracture in the Veldari Directorate was genuine and significant, and was going to produce changes in Veldari governance over the next decade regardless of anything Earth or the working group did. The second was that some of the people inside that fleet had been carrying out orders they had not been given the full truth about, and that when the full truth arrived, through our intercept, through the ceasefire negotiations, through the public accounting that had been happening in the galactic press for weeks, some of those people had made a different choice about what to do with it. I thought about the 2 kinds of messages I had received from Earth. The ones that said you did the right thing, and the ones that said you have made us a rogue state. I thought about the working group with no name and no charter, and no fixed headquarters. I thought about the question, what are we now? I thought about Nadia Reeves, who had been quiet through most of the conversation and had afterward written 3 pages of notes so detailed and perceptive that I sent them directly to Aldrich, without addition. I thought about Owen Garrett, the medic on the Meridian, who had walked into the refugee hold with a scanner before anyone told him to. I thought about Claire Bates transmitting no, in response to a 10,000-year-old convention, and doing it without hesitation because Mays had given the order, and she had understood the order, and that was enough. I thought about what we were, not the framework version of us, not the advisory status members, the emotional and impulsive ones kept on a short leash, the real version, the version that showed up in the moment. We were the medic who doesn't wait. We were the fleet that won't stop. We were the species that listened to intercepts and refused a ceasefire because we knew what the ceasefire was for. We were the people who brought food to the hold before anyone asked. We were the ones who sent 3 words on an encrypted channel and then came when it mattered. We were also the ones who got 4,000 letters from home, and some of them said you were wrong, and we had to hold that too. The final conclave session I attended in my capacity as working group representative was 6 months after the engagement. The vote was on whether to formally recognize the working group as a secondary mediation body within the conclave structure. Not a replacement, not a rival, but an additional mechanism for situations where the standard timeline was incompatible with the scale of what was happening. The vote failed, narrowly. 12 votes short of the threshold. I was not surprised. I had known it was going to fail. The conclave was not ready to formally acknowledge that it had needed a secondary mechanism in the first place. That would come later, when the accounting had continued long enough for the discomfort of the Auran situations to outweigh the discomfort of admitting the framework had a gap. Political institutions move on their own timeline, and the working group could continue to function without formal recognition, and we all knew that. On the walk out of the chamber, Sivan caught up with me in the corridor. He moved quietly for someone his size, and I heard him only when he spoke. "You know this is not finished," he said. "I know," I said. "The Veldari Directorate will recover. They will reorganize. They have done it before. And they will be angry, and they will have the full weight of the legal framework behind them, and they will use it." "I know that too," I said. He was quiet for a moment. We were walking slowly, 2 people with nowhere immediately urgent to be, moving through a corridor on the largest diplomatic platform in the galaxy, carrying the weight of a conversation that had been happening in various forms for months. "You don't seem frightened," he said. I stopped walking. The honest answer was that I was frightened. I had been frightened since the moment I opened the encrypted channel on my observation vessel and typed 3 words into it. I was frightened in the meeting with the Veldari reformists. I was frightened reading the messages from home. I wrote letters to people I loved every night from my bunk on whatever vessel I happened to be on, and the letters were full of things I could not say in official reports: the uncertainty, the weight, the moments where I looked at what we had done and could not tell where righteous ended and reckless began. I told Sivan all of that. I told him I was scared and tired, and I had not slept properly in months, and I was doing the math on the consequences of what we had started, and the numbers were not simple. He listened. He was very good at listening. "Then why continue?" he said. I thought about the 42-minute broadcast, about the thermal imaging of Velsor, about the 6 refugee ships in the dark with failing life support, about the Auran Elder's message, the wound that changes you permanently but does not destroy you. "Because the alternative," I said, "is watching, and I cannot watch anymore. I found that out, and there is no taking it back." Sivan was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I did not expect. He said, "No, there is not." We stood in the corridor for another moment without speaking. Then he nodded, once and turned and walked the other way. I watched him go. Then I went to find a shuttle back to the working group's temporary platform, where Nadia Reeves was waiting with a briefing on the next phase of Auran resettlement negotiations, and where Owen Garrett had apparently sent a personal donation to the Auran Medical Relief Fund that was twice his monthly salary, and where Captain Mays had sent a 3-line message asking how the vote had gone and expressing exactly as much surprise at the result as he had expressed at everything else, which was none. The last thing that happened that day was a message from the Auran Elder. She was on one of the settlement convoy ships, not a refugee vessel anymore, she told me, a settler ship, which was a different thing, and she wanted me to understand the difference. They were moving toward a new world, a provisional world, Still being negotiated, still being prepared, but moving toward it. She sent one word. I knew it before the translation arrived. I had known it since the first time she said it to me, on the refugee vessel, in the stale air and the crowded dark, when I had told her in her own language that we had seen and we had come, witnessed. I sat with the word for a long time. I thought about what it meant to be witnessed. To have the full weight of what you are seen by someone who chooses to see it and does not look away. I thought about the 42-minute broadcast and what it meant that I had watched all of it. I thought about what the elder had said. The wound that changes you permanently, she was right. I had been changed. We had all been changed. The fleet, the crew of the Meridian, Earth itself, whatever Earth was in the process of becoming in the galaxy's eyes and in its own. Something had shifted in the shape of things, and the shift was permanent, and the cost of it was real and ongoing and not simple. But the Auran elder was on a ship moving toward a world, not a refugee vessel in the dark with failing life support. A settler ship with a destination. That was also real. That was also permanent. I wrote back the same word I had written before. I wrote it and I meant it the same way I had always meant it. Both things at once. The way the word demanded. Witnessed. Remembered both.